So today I'm going to talk about the Mars Science Laboratory's flight software from the perspective of creating a platform for science and mobility. So as many of you know, the Mars Science Laboratory launched in November of 2011. You see that here. And you know, there really was 3 different spacecraft in one, right? We had a cruise and approach, which was 8.5 months long. I'm sure you guys all were paying close attention to that. And then we went through entry, descent, and landing using our descent stage. And then we're currently now in the surface mission with the actual Curiosity rover. And so a couple months ago, about 3 months ago now, you guys all witnessed and experienced the very, very exciting entry, descent, and landing of Curiosity with the sky crane. And here are some pictures from landing night. I'm sure you all see. Here's the flight software operations team on landing night. Very emotional and exciting time, and the very famous picture of Brian Schratz here pointing at, as we got the first pictures back of the wheels touching down on the surface of Mars. So highly, highly successful landing, but MSL didn't stop there. This was kind of the big media blitz excitement portion that everyone saw on the news, but that wasn't the end. What now? Well, now we're actually on the surface of Mars, and our landing site is a place called Gale Crater. There were several different landing site options that were being considered by the science team. Why did we choose to land right here in Gale Crater? Gale Crater is approximately 96 kilometers across, and the reason it was chosen is of all the landing sites, this is actually the deepest crater, okay? So what you see on the edge of the landing site is millions of years of exposed bedrock and allowing the scientists to really explore all of the different possible geological features that they want to look at. So Gale Crater really was the best landing option because of how deep it is and how much exposure was given to just the history of the planet. And so now that we're on the surface, with the excitement of EDL, it's very easy to forget why we're actually there. We didn't actually go to Mars to do EDL, believe it or not. We actually went to Mars to perform science. And so Curiosity's primary scientific goals are to explore and quantitatively assess this region of Mars, the Gale Crater region of Mars, for potential habitat, past, present, or future for life. So biological potential, geology and geochemistry, the role of water, and to characterize the surface radiation. Okay, so I'm going, and this is accomplished by a suite of 10 instruments. This truly is a roving science laboratory. This is a huge amount of payload that we sent. And so here is just a quick depiction of all the different instruments on board MSL. And we'll talk a bit about each of these in the future. But I want to give you guys show you guys a little video of what it looks like, what MSL looks like roving, what a typical day looks like for MSL on the surface. Okay, that's not far enough. Here we go. So now you see MSL safely on the surface of Mars. And time to go to sleep and recharge the batteries. Here's our little antenna. And overhead passes one of our orbiters and says, "Wake up, Curiosity, it's time to do your stuff." And Curiosity wakes up. Just so you know, it really does not move anywhere near that fast. This is like mega fast forward.
So this arm kind of...
That's not the arm. That's the remote sensing mast.
And this mast kind of folds every night, or?
Yes, we stow the mast and then redeploy it when we use it.
What kind of power hit do we get with that?
I don't know what the power draw is on the mast.
I'm sure it's...
There's our high gain antenna, an MRO or Odyssey, I don't know which one that is. One of our orbiting assets. So you're probably wondering, what is that? Why does it have such a big butt? It's so huge. What's that thing coming out the back? That's the RTG. That's the radioisotope thermoelectric generator. That's what gives MSL its power. MSL is nuclear powered. Every night it goes to sleep and the RTG recharges its batteries and then it wakes up and runs off the batteries during the day. So that's why the expected, oh, there's the parachute. That's why the expected lifespan of MSL is so long, because we do have a nuclear asset on board.
How fast is it actually moving?
It's actually moving at, let's see. I used to know the numbers. I think I have them in the presentation, so hold that question. Very, very slow.
How slow is it moving at?
Very slow. So this does actually happen. We get pictures back from Curiosity, and then scientists look at the pictures and basically say, hey, that looks like an interesting geological feature, and then we plan a drive to go to that feature and do science. So that's kind of what you're seeing here in this depiction.
Are all the instruments working?
Yep. Mm-hmm. We have not had any problems yet. Knock on wood. This is like super fast motion. Right, exactly. And so now you're going to actually see some of the instruments at work. No, this is the cool part, is we don't have to go there. With our new Chemin instrument, we're actually able to zap things with our laser and actually do science based on the plume that's created from the laser zap. So I have a couple slides on that later. And now you're asking about the arm. This is the arm. This arm weighs more than the original MER rover. This arm is a spacecraft. It is an engineering feat in and of itself. It is unbelievably massive, to the point where we actually had to, when it was on Earth and we were testing the arm, they actually had to use special motors to help lift the arm, because the motors couldn't actually lift the whole arm in Earth's gravity. It was only able to do so in Martian gravity. It's absolutely massive. So there's a drill, right? And there's also, in the bed of the rover, something called SAM, which is sample acquisition on Mars. And so samples can be taken, and then you'll see these inlet covers open up. And we place the sample inside the inlet, inside SAM. And now inside the rover, we actually can do a lot of cool science on the sample that we take. Pretty exciting stuff, right?
I mean, doing all that without a graduate student.
What?
Doing all that work without a graduate student.
Exactly, exactly. Yes, it is awesome. So now I'm going to stow my arm. And move on to my next destination. All right. So as you guys can see just from that video, okay, that's a video of a typical operation of MSL. Hugely, hugely complex, right? Unbelievable, like, you know, science fiction mission objectives, right? How do you deal with unprecedented complexity and mission objectives? The goals of this 1-ton super rover are to nail the landing, which we did, drive somewhere cool, and do neat science stuff like zap things with a laser and scoop dirt and take cool pictures, right? And it was our job, it was the job of the flight software team to make that possible, okay? How were we supposed to do that? Well, unlike the previous pictures that just showed the four of us on landing night, it was actually a huge team of people that made this possible. The flight software team was approximately, Merrick, what was it, 30 people? 40 people, 40 people that made this possible. And there's me hiding in my sunglasses. And yeah, and if you, just to like give you kind of an idea, that's Pathfinder, that's MER, and that's MSL. So you can see the increase in size is really kind of a metaphor for the increase in complexity. So for example, we had a controlled landing on Pathfinder. On MER, our airbag landing on Pathfinder, we had an airbag landing on rovers. MSL was way too massive. We had to use the sky crane. Huge amount of complexity. Yes, I call it the 1-ton rover on steroids. It's huge. Single string. We had a dual string computers with a cold backup and a ton of device redundancy. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. We went from RAD 6000 to RAD 750 with 256 megs of RAM and a 2 gigabyte flash. 3 science instruments, 10 science instruments. 30-day Sol mission, 90-day Sol mission, although we're still going with Opportunity. Our primary mission is 2 years, but who knows how long we'll be operating on the surface with that RTG on the back, right? So you can see this is a tremendous increase in complexity from where we were with Pathfinder. Uh-oh. It stopped working again. That's all right. I'm flexible. Or not. There we go. Okay, so how do we deal with this? Well, what we needed to do from the flight software perspective is really create a robust flight software infrastructure. In other words, we were creating a platform to enable EDL, mobility, and science. And I really think there were 5 key components to creating this robust flight software infrastructure. We used a component architecture. We did a lot of work on redundancy management. We utilized design patterns throughout the flight software. Fault protection, which not typically thought of as infrastructure, but I'm throwing it out there that I think our fault protection was part of the infrastructure that made EDL, mobility, and science possible. And then leveraging very powerful avionics, which is an interesting topic in and of itself. So I'm going to talk about each of these different aspects of the flight software separately. The MSL flight software conceptual architecture. This is the architecture of MSL. It is a component-based architecture, and we spent a lot of work refactoring the software from a largely MER heritage software into this component-based architecture, where we grouped modules groups of modules into components that achieved a particular purpose. So a component exports an interface and identifies interfaces it needs to function. The idea being that any one of these components can be replaced by another component that utilizes the same interfaces and that exports the same interfaces and depends on interfaces that are already there. So this truly is a component-based architecture. In addition, it is also a layered architecture, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So if we look at this was the overall flight software when going into cruise EDL, and then when we finished EDL, that component was removed. Okay, so you're easily able to pull out the cruise and EDL component, and what you see left. Seriously? There we go. What you see left is the surface software. And this really is the surface sampling, the mobility, and the science instrument component. And you can see that the dependencies are all downward. So we really were creating this platform. This system, this is fault protection up here, and I'm going to talk about that separately because it is kind of special. I can say that because I wrote it. We really created this platform from which we could do these higher level activities and behaviors, okay? So let's talk a little bit about that layering then. Functions versus activities. So the avionics layer components export what we called functional interfaces. And these functional interfaces provide access to performing primitive atomic actions. So if you go back and look at the avionics software, it really is the C&DH component plus the EPS component, the electrical power system component. On MSL, the avionics between these two components were so tightly coupled that we had to kind of create this avionics layer that contained both the C&DH and the EPS components. And so these functional interfaces contain things like turn on a switch, okay, or make a data product, okay. These are individual actions that do not require or do not hold on to any resources, okay? They happen individually and they happen atomically, all right? So then the application layer components export activity interfaces. So activities decompose into a set of functions that together achieve a particular goal. So if we did our job right, if we did the layering right and we did the componentization right, these components, this infrastructure provides all the functions, atomic functions necessary to perform activities at these higher application levels, okay? And that's exactly what we did. So our activities become drive to a target, analyze a sample, and these are orchestrated by the mobility and surface sampling components using these atomic functions provided by the flight software infrastructure. So that was a very powerful concept in the MSL flight software was the architecture. The ability to componentize the architecture and layer those components in such a way that we could separate functional interfaces from activity interfaces, all right? Redundancy management. MSL has an unprecedented amount of redundancy, from switches to entire boxes to even our computers. MSL is nothing if not redundant, okay? We had to be. This is like a $2.8 billion spacecraft. We needed to make this thing land on Mars, right? So one of the things that we struggled with, but was also an incredibly powerful tool, is that we had to abstract the underlying redundancy away from the application components. So those lower level components, the actual components that interface with the hardware, we spent a lot of time making sure that, yes, they had knowledge of the redundancy, they managed the redundancy, but the higher level application components did not see that. Okay, one of the best examples of this are device swaps during active attitude control. So one of the things that we did during cruise and EDL was we actually had to do TCMs, trajectory correction maneuvers, and we had a module, we had a component, a module in the cruise component that did this auto maneuvering. All right, and so we had a piece of software at this lower level, at the EPS level, that avionics layer, that actually managed device swaps. Okay, and one of the things that we needed to be able to swap were the power analog modules. These are huge boxes. Okay, the power analog module contains everything from the pyro cards, the load control cards, the guidance navigation cards, and the REU, the remote engineering unit, which is really the workhorse of the avionics, okay? So we had redundant PAMs on MSL. Every pair of PAM, every type of PAM was redundant. So the cruise power analog modules had this thing called a JID. Now, when we were doing these telemetry correction maneuvers, what happens if you're in the middle of this massive turn, this massive attitude correction, and you have a problem with one of your guidance interface cards? What do? Do you abort the whole maneuver? Do you and go into safing and possibly leave yourself in a crazy attitude? Might not want to do that, right, on your way to Mars. So what we did is that, we go back to this picture a second, this cruise EDL component made use of an atomic action in the flight software to do a PAM swap. Okay, it accessed this EPS component, a module called PAM Manager, to actually use the redundant backup PAM to try the other JID. So if you notice here, the JIDs are not cross-strapped. They actually come right off of, there's a JID A and a JID B, which for legacy reasons causes a lot of trouble because all the rest of the cards on the PAMs were actually cross-strapped, which was annoying. inconsistency. But anyway, so what the attitude control system would do is saying, hey, I have a problem. I can't attain my attitude. I am going to actually try with this other PAM. And so by creating that, by abstracting the redundancy, right, by saying, here's a good PAM, use this one instead, we're actually able to make the system more robust. Does that make sense? And this higher level, I should point out that by the abstraction of this redundancy just said, okay, try the backup. It didn't have to know about the fact that all of these load control cards had certain switches on, right? And so when you swap to this backup unit, you have to make all the switches on that backup side mirror what was on that front side, right? All the configuration that was on this PAM, you now have to put it onto this PAM. That's all handled by the lower layers. The higher layers didn't have to see any of that detail, right? It was all abstracted away. That made our jobs a lot easier, right? Push down the redundancy, push down the complexity, make the higher level components really agnostic to what's happening at the lower levels. Use of patterns. All right, so you've seen this is a very complex rover, tons of redundancy. We needed to ensure that these application components could expect consistent behavior throughout the infrastructure. And we were able to accomplish this through the use of patterns. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. So as you guys have seen, this thing is really complex. Hundreds of switches. Hundreds of redundant switches to all the different pieces throughout the spacecraft. I mean, this thing had tons of switches. So how do you manage switch state? How do you make sure that the higher levels in the system had a consistent idea of what it meant to power something on or to power it off? And we used patterns to do that. We enforced these patterns throughout the system. So we have a power module in the EPS component that actually does the power switching. But then all of the device interfaces throughout the system had to follow this pattern. Okay, and this made the application layer components, they knew what to expect, right? They knew that that you would go to power on, and then you'd start in an unknown state, right? This was very key for us, that the idea of this unknown state, right? And so, and that if it's on and you power it on, you assert the power on. So following this pattern, it made the applications have an idea of, okay, I know that all devices follow this power pattern, right? This also makes the job much easier on the ground. If a fault happens, then you know kind of what, you can have a sense of where things may have broken down because it follows this pattern. Similarly with fault protection, our monitor pattern, our global monitor pattern. So we have monitors all throughout the system that allow us to do fault monitoring, right? And so all the monitors follow this exact pattern, right? That we have, they're green if we have not met any sort of fault limit. We have a yellow if you hit the local limit, and I'll talk about what that means on the next slide, and red when you hit the fault limit, okay? And so this pattern made it very easy to standardize all the monitors in the system and expect and understand the behavior of the system at the higher application levels because it followed this pattern. So let's delve into fault protection a little bit more. So why do I put this as part of infrastructure? Because it really, fault protection is although it's typically thought of as this kind of high-level system behavior thing, fall protection really is pervasive. It's throughout the entire system. And so if you build it right, it's throughout the entire system. So the mobility in science, they shouldn't have to worry about the safety of the vehicle, right? They should just be able to go and do some science or drive somewhere. So the infrastructure, in addition to providing this platform for us to do mobility in science, it also needs to keep the vehicles safe and preserve the ability to use the wake cycle for mobility in science and not just sitting there and safing, right? If we're sitting and safing during a wake cycle, that's a loss, okay? That is time loss, that's science loss, that's driving loss, okay? So, principle, I'm going to start with this one down here. Faults should be detected and corrected as close to the fault as possible, at the lowest layer in the flight software possible. So that's why back in this monitor pattern, we actually have local fault protection and system fault protection. So basically what we want to do is at those lower layers, at the avionics level, at the device level, if we detect a fault, we want to take some local action and try to correct and clear that monitor and take us back here. The more faults we can correct at the local level, the more we preserve our ability to do science and roving. Okay, and so that's key. So we want to catch as much here as possible. It's funny, I wrote the system fault protection software, so part of me wants it to run. But at the same time, you don't want it to run, right? You want to stay in this loop right down here. You want to clear as many faults as possible. Because what happens when you go red is the big stuff runs. So this is where now it is possibly an issue with the safety of the vehicle, and we have to take more draconian action and actually reconfigure possibly the avionics and go into safing. So if you can fix it at the low level, great. If you can't, then what we do is we try to diagnose the fault and actually configure the avionics in such a way that we think we've corrected the problem, put the spacecraft into a safe state, thereby preserving science and mobility for the future, and then we let the ground actually come up with any recovery actions and bring this spacecraft out of safing. Okay, so we're still trying to preserve the ability to do science and mobility, but we actually are conceding that, we need to give up some wake cycles because something really bad has happened. Let's have the ground come in and try and figure out what's going on. Powerful avionics. MSL utilized extremely powerful FPGAs to augment our main computers. And the flight software utilized the capabilities in these FPGAs to enhance the robustness and availability of our mobility and science platform. So the capabilities of these FPGAs really are part of the infrastructure platform. Example, the wake up and shutdown that you guys see, this autonomous wake up and shutdown capability for recharging the batteries for the next day of operations, that's all done in the FPGA. It's all done by the REU FPGA, okay? It has an internal state machine called PPROM, Personality PROM, that actually shuts the spacecraft down and wakes it up in the morning. And this was done on MER as well, right? The wake up and shutdown capability. But MSL took this to a whole nother level, all right? We developed new and innovative approaches to saving battery life and extending the productivity of that operations window, right? So we talked about preserving the wake cycle for doing mobility in science. How can we do that even more? We did that using FPGAs, and the best example of this is something called dream mode, although when we first invented it, a couple of us were calling it nightmare mode because we were kind of scared of what might happen. So dream mode is another capability built into the REU FPGA. which allows us to prepare for the day's science activities. So previously, like on MER, for example, you'd actually have to bring up the entire computer to warm up to the operational thermal limits. Okay, so bringing up the whole flight computer, that sucks a ton of power, right? So, but you need to get the thermal characteristics ready on the science instruments and on the wheels and the actuators and everything so you can actually do your mobility and science for the day. So how can we, as an engineering team, make that possible without sucking all the power of bringing the whole flight computer up? And we did that through the MREU FPGA. So what we did is we actually gave the REU enough smarts to actually go and flip thermal switches in the night while it's sleeping. So the flight computer remains asleep, and while it's dreaming, the REU is going off and heating up the rover. So that when we're actually ready to wake up, we've preserved our power and now we're ready to go thermally. Huge accomplishment for the avionics and flight software team in really creating this robust infrastructure platform for doing science. All right, so there it is on the surface. This is the latest mosaic from the ARM self-portrait taken from the ARM of MSL. So by employing all of these different techniques in the flight software, we were able to create this robust platform for doing science and mobility. You can see the tracks there, so I'll show you a couple cool pictures. So this is Mount Sharp. This is our destination. So that is a far, far away place, but we are on our way to going there. And so right now this is where we landed at Bradbury Landing, and we're driving to our first destination, which is Glen Elg. And on our way, so we're on our way to Glen Elg, but this is Mount Sharp. That was that mountain in the distance that I just showed you. So here's Mount Sharp. On our way, we want to stop at Glen Elg, and here's kind of the big picture. That's where we landed, there's Glen Elg, and that's where we want to go, okay? Now, look at the scale. Doesn't seem very far, but look at how far we've been able to travel in 90 days, so it's going to take us a while to get there. I love this picture. So this is the undercarriage of the rover driving from the Molly camera. And here's a picture from MRO, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, of how this was taken pretty early on, and you can see the tracks and how far we've driven on the surface. So ChemCam, we talked about the zapping things with the laser. So this is the first thing we zapped, this N165 rock. And you can see the spectral analysis that we got back from the coronation, so that plume that develops when you zap things with a laser. We get unbelievably interesting data back about what these rocks are actually comprised of. And we didn't even touch it, we just zapped it. It's so cool. And here you can see a picture of the little laser holes in the rock. I don't know, I think that's neat. We left, it's like, not only are we leaving tracks on Mars, but we're also leaving little, zappy holes from the laser. It's pretty cool. So we found a place where, we're driving along, and we found a location where there's a lot of dirt available. You can see the wheel went in, and it was pretty deep. So we decided to take a scoop. And so this is the first time we used this scoop on MSL, and then we were able to actually intake that into the rover and do analysis. Again, truly a roving science laboratory.
What's the size of this scoop?
Like the size of a palm of your hand, yeah. And so I will leave you with the last picture, self-portrait using the arm. So I'd like to open up for any questions. Go ahead.
How much of the software were you actually able to really button up before launch? How much have you had to update both in-flight and post-landing?
That's a great question. We made a huge push right before launch to get the launch load ready. And the launch load was solid. The launch load was very solid, and we launched with it. However, it was not meant for either EDL or surface operations. We finished the EDL build on the way to Mars, although I would say that there was not a huge difference between the launch load and the EDL build. There were very targeted changes made to the launch load for EDL, but it wasn't like we were writing the EDL code on the way to Mars. It was not that at all. That being said, Second Chance was written on the way to Mars, okay? But the mainline flight software was only augmented after launch. The surface software was not ready at all as part of the launch load. We did put that off to develop while we were in cruise, and the majority of that was like the mobility and navigation software. Go ahead.
Hey, first of all, congratulations. So it does.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Very, very cool.
Yes.
I have a son, and he thinks it's very, very neat. He's 5 years old, and then we have this robot on Mars. I was curious, what's the, as far as the amount of data that telemetry has to push back to Earth, what's the biggest, not bottleneck, but what's the biggest chunk of data? I guess it's the raw image stuff that has to be
Yeah,
sent back?
it's the images. The images are huge, and that's not really, it's not a the bottleneck is really the availability of the DSN, which we've pretty much had. I mean, the DSN has pretty much been given to MSL, you know, during this time or whatever. But we have to go through the orbiters, right? So everything gets funneled through the orbiters. And so it's the combination of things moving through the orbiters and our DSN time that really dictates how much data we can get back in any given pass.
Is it to the point that scientists have to be selective, or is most of the data able to be downlinked, and then they're able to?
As far as I know, to this point, all of the data has been downlinked, right? Go ahead.
I have a two-part question.
Sure.
First, maybe not for you, the first one is, if you see the pictures on the Rover, even the previous one, it was the self-portrait, you see how all these vital parts are all exposed, cables and all that?
Yeah.
Is that a deliberate decision not to have them protected? Because I know there's storms, there's pebbles being blown, and all that. Yeah, I could go back to the self-portrait piece. You see that there's so much stuff that can get damaged, and cables are unprotected. Was that deliberate? Save weight? Why was that done?
Well, okay, so I can't answer that because I'm not a hardware engineer and I really don't know. But this rover is extremely heavy. So I imagine that part of it probably was to save weight. But these things, I mean, everything you see here is covered. And our Atlo guys, the guys that actually build this, I mean, they know what they're doing. I am sure that whatever is exposed on this rover is...
I'm wondering why it's
Yeah, I imagine it probably has to do with weight, but again, I'm not a hardware person, so I can't really speak to that.
And the second part was, when this thing is driving, do you have to program every step, or it's using some part of, let's say, artificial intelligence to figure out where to go and how to go around obstacles? Or? So
there are different methods by which we drive. When we're in certain modes of driving, we target certain waypoints, and the ground team uploads like a drive sequence. There's another piece of software called AutoNav that does longer, more autonomous drives. So it depends on what mode of driving the operations team is using. Up to this point, I do not believe, Merritt, correct me if I'm wrong, we have used AutoNav yet. So that's something. Yes, we could.
Should be able to.
Oh yeah.
Figure things out.
Totally. And it was the similar software used on MER. I think you had your hand up first. Yeah.
So you talked about this dream mode. How did that end
Oh, that is a great question. Oh, the problems we've had with, so yes, as I was on the systems fall protection team as well, so I did a lot of the design of the fall protection as well. One of the huge challenges we had with system fall protection was the interaction between the flight software, the REU, and the code running on the REU. When you have multiple controllers in a system, you are bound to run into problems, especially when your main controller, the flight software, doesn't have a model inside of it of what is happening in the other controller, right? So we ran into a lot of problems with that. We had to make significant, because the REU Dream Mode not only does like the thermal warm up, but it also does fault protection as well. It will wake the rover up if any sort of thermal thing goes out of whack, right? So Dream Mode is doing fault protection. The REU is also doing your under voltage protection. So if you are sleeping and you have a UV event, an under voltage event, it'll wake the rover up and run through fault protection itself. So there was all of this interaction between these internal state machines in the REU and the fall protection on the rover. And so yeah, it was a huge impact. It took us many hours and many sleepless nights to come up with designs to fix it. But you know, lesson learned, have one controller in your system. Go ahead.
So FPGA was kind of hybrid software and hardware.
Right.
That complicates the development and validation and verification.
Well, in what way?
Well, is that the flight software responsibility or the hardware responsibility?
Right. Okay. So we worked very closely with the avionics chief engineer, and I actually wrote a large portion of the software that was on the FPGA. So there was a very close relationship between the flight software team and the avionics team, and it was coordinated very tightly. And we actually had design meetings where we were making decisions. We're allocating this functionality to the flight software. We're allocating this functionality to the FPGA. So it was all very tightly coordinated, and the people that were writing the code, like myself, for the FPGA were also on the flight software team. It was myself and one other girl that wrote the code for that FPGA. So it was all very tightly coordinated. And it just so happens that her and I were also the fall protection designers. So it all kind of was good and incestuous, and it worked out well. Back there in the corner.
Just out of curiosity, out of scope, how large was the code base for the entire program?
1 million lines of handwritten code and about 3 million lines of autocode. Right, Merrick?
We had, all the handwritten, there was about 800,000 lines, not counting comments or blanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yeah, 1 million is usually my canned answer.
That's the manual.
What?
800,000, 1 million. It's all
Yeah, it's about the same. It's in that region. Okay, I think you had a question?
The question you said about daily operations, are those Mars days or Earth days?
Good question. It's Martian days. It's based on Martian days, although we just transitioned off of Mars time. So we were on Mars time for the first 90 sols. A sol is a Martian day, right? So we were on Mars time for the first 90 sols, and now everybody's back on Earth time, thankfully. Go ahead.
At the overall vehicle system high level, how do you manage the timelines? Do you have like a scripting language or a scripting engine on board that you upload timelines to on a regular basis?
No. What do you mean timelines that do what?
Daily service operations.
Sequences. Yes, we upload sequences to the rover, and those sequences are what accomplish what the rover is going to do on a daily basis. On the ground side, we have sequence tools that 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 the operators use to construct the sequences, validate them, verify them before they get uplinked to the spacecraft. Is that what your question is?
It's like a scripting language, like a VML kind of?
Yes, it is a scripting language, but it's an in-house scripting language. In the back?
What's the split between explicit instructions to the rover and autonomous navigation?
What do you mean the split?
You can control the actual how far a wheel turns explicitly.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also say, okay, go over to that rock over there
Mm-hmm.
and have it decide how to get there. And I was just curious how much of the scripting language would be the explicit.
So it's neither of those things. Like the second thing you asked, that's the auto nav stuff, okay? But the software that actually does the driving is kind of in between those two things. There's like an actual, the mobility team has their own tools for driving and for constructing drives. So they actually like plot it out beforehand. The rover planners do, the rover drivers do this beforehand and then uplink it. So it's really, it's point-to-point driving. It's not so much like, I don't know, turn this wheel this many degrees or whatever. It's more of a like point-to-point driving. You had one?
Yes, we talked about the FPGAs. What model of FPGA did you use?
They're all in-house. Go ahead.
I have two questions. You mentioned something about a auto-generated code.
Mm-hmm.
What tool did you use for that?
It's all handwritten. Handwritten autocoders. We wrote the autocoders.
Oh, you wrote the
Yeah.
So this is a JPL product?
JPL, yeah.
Okay, yeah, the second question is, could you describe the software verification effort that
Sure.
you took to develop the software?
That-
How much hardware in the loop versus software?
Absolutely.
in the vehicle system?
So we have a verification and validation like chain, if you will, and it starts with unit testing. We had a very intensive unit test campaign, if you will. I think in one of my modules that has maybe like, one of my modules had maybe, 2,000-3,000 lines of code, and my unit test code for that module was 10,000-12,000 lines of code. So our unit test, we had a unit test harness and a very strict unit test program. So the developer really did do glass box testing, poking at everything in the unit test environment, okay?
On that note, are you using some type of test-driven development tool?
No,
to do
no. Handwritten.
Handwritten?
Yep. Handwritten unit tests.
Okay.
Then we have a FIT team, Flight Software Internal Test. And the Flight Software Internal Test team uses our workstation test set, Wistis, that's our simulation environment, and runs Python scripts to do kind of, I call it gray box testing. It's not white box, it's not black box, it's flight software developers that kind of know how the flight software works, but they really are testing the functional interfaces into the software. So the FIT team does that testing, and it's scripted with Python to do that testing. The software then goes to the BIT team, the build integration test team, and they're the ones that actually build the release. So they test both in Wistis and on the actual hardware, on the test bed. They have a regression test that they run for every single build they make. And it's a kind of standard set of functional interfaces into the flight software. We then take the software after it's passed, so now it's passed unit testing, FIT testing, BIT testing. Now we finally deliver it to the systems team for tests, and that's called SIT, Systems Integration and Test. And then they actually test the software against the requirements in the test bed and against our simulation environment and against their verification items or VIs. So that's the test campaign for one release of software.
Okay, so that last step, is that primarily what
Yep, it's all run on the flight software on the hardware. Like I said, but we do it beforehand. The developers do it as part of their development, and the bit team does it when they do the regression testing. But the systems team really is what takes it to the actual hardware to the full extent. Go ahead.
A couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
First one is about science data. Is there an onboard storage capability?
Yes, we have non-volatile storage. We have 2 gigs of flash.
Okay. Oh, you mentioned that.
Yeah.
And approximately, it really depends on the individual science instruments, like how many days worth or hours worth of data can be stored.
It depends on what the data is. The images are huge, so
Absolutely.
yeah.
And images, and what about the chemical analysis stuff?
That's not anywhere near the size of the images.
The
Yeah.
second question is about fault testing. So which is like a subset of the process that you already described about different stages of testing. Was there any special emphasis on particular scenarios for fault testing, or and then a related sub question? Did you guys find a specific scenario once the rover was on Mars that you guys could have missed or something?
Oh yeah.
Okay,
Oh,
so
absolutely.
any experiences there?
So we went through a significant amount of fall protection stress testing. No pun intended. It was stressful on me for other reasons, but we basically tested against the requirements, and then we tried to test all the different fall conditions that happened. This thing is insanely complicated. Did we test every possible scenario? Absolutely not. It's impossible. There's no way. We had a really gangbusters team of testers that did some crazy corner cases. And I think another thing is there was kind of this small group of us. There was about 5 of us who were kind of the core of the system behavior fault protection team, and we were in rooms together every day, poring over the design, coming up with scenarios. And I think toward the end we were feeding off of each other's paranoia. I mean, we weren't sleeping, we were coming up with these crazy things. I mean, Tracy, the other fault protection person, she'd come up with some scenario. I'd freak out, I'd be convinced we were gonna, crash into the surface of Mars. I'd go in front of the project and be like, death, doom, destruction. And they would be like, it's fine, Katie, just, So we tested a lot of things. But yeah, I mean, there are absolutely things where we found one problem on the before EDL where it was a weird interaction between fault protection and the EDL timeline, that if the timing was just right in just this tiny little window and these conditions were to occur, it could have reset the computer in the middle of EDI. Yes, it's a risk trade. You have to balance the risk of changing the software at that point, or accepting the fact that this is probably not going to happen, right? And there are other fault conditions that we discovered on the way to Mars, where we're like, okay, this could be, we may not wake up if this fault happens. And we did fix those and upload them to the service build. But it was a very strenuous process of kind of poring over the risk and trying to make educated decisions about which way to go.
Is there a specific technique that you guys used to actually sort out this thing, or it was a lot of brainstorming?
It was a ton of brainstorming and long discussions.
Lots of coffee too, right?
Yes, for a lot of Starbucks. Go ahead.
When you're describing the flight software and your million lines of code, does that include the science instruments, or are they really down below and they have their own software?
Okay, so the instruments themselves have their own software. The flight software has wrappers for interfacing into those instruments. So that's the portion of the instrument code that is ours. It's kind of the interface software to the instruments. Go ahead.
I know that
on the ground that you couldn't duplicate?
Oh, yes. Well, the
I know that's a great area, but what did you guys do with
the poster child of that is our reset anomaly during cruise. So there was a problem that we kept seeing before launch. And what did we do with it? It was tagged as a red flag PFR, and it was a lien against launch. We decided to launch accepting the risk that we did not understand what the problem was. We could not duplicate it, okay? 3 days after launch, it happened on board. And we were stupefied. It was scary. And the signature, I remember I was on ops, we got the data down, the signature was identical. I mean, and we were just like, oh, you have got to be kidding me. 3 days after launch, we hit it. And so we just dug in. And the crazy thing about it is that what it prevented us from doing, this is why it was a red flag PFR, it actually prevented us from getting into celestial mode. And celestial mode is the mode where it's our attitude control mode, where we're actually actively using the stars to like figure out our attitude. This is the mode we're in EDL. So 3 days after launch, we realized we can't get into celestial. It's mission ending if we can't fix it. I mean, you're done, right? So yeah, it was crazy, but that's what you do. You flag it as a red flag PFR, you accept the risk, and then if it happens, well, you have a lot of sleepless nights until you figure out what the problem is.
So I assume y'all-
Yes, we fixed it, yes. Anything else? Oh, back there.
What is the latency on the map and telemetry then?
20 minutes. Round trip light time. Go ahead.
Flight software was written in what language?
C, plain C.
Like, no, C++.
There is some C++, and it's in the navigation software. And only one developer uses it. The rest is in C. Back there?
Yeah, a couple of questions. So did you have any code coverage metrics when you were doing this?
Yes, we did. We have GCOV. We use GCOV for our unit testing, and that was part of our unit test checklist, was to ensure code coverage. And we had a unit test review that actually went through any code that wasn't covered to ensure that, that was acceptable or can be waived.
Right. So did you do code coverage at the source level or at the assembly level?
The source level.